Arabs are not victims. To claim otherwise is laughable, like saying someone hit my fist with their eye. It's a ridiculous inversion of reality, a narrative that obscures a far more complex and uncomfortable truth. For centuries, the Arab world has been the conqueror until they were conquered. They were the oppressor until they were oppressed. Yet, the myth of perpetual victimhood persists, shielding a history of conquest, enslavement, and cultural erasure from scrutiny. The Arabs are the only victims with a superiority complex. I don't want to get into a shouting contest with an Arab, but one can argue that they have done more harm than good as a people. While Western imperialism and exploitation have undeniably left global scars, the Arab world's own history reveals complex layers of power. From ancient empires to modern states, this region has been both conqueror and conquered, a dynamic often overlooked in polarized debates. Long before European imperialism, the Arab conquests of the 7th century reshaped continents. Alongside trade and scholarship came practices like slavery, where African captives, referred to as abd in Arabic, were traded for centuries. This system, rooted in pre-Islamic tribal conflicts, persisted long after the transatlantic slave trade began. Similarly, systems of segregation existed in Arab states long before South Africa's apartheid. Minority groups like the Kurds, Berbers, and Copts faced marginalization under Arab-majority rule, a reality that complicates simplistic narratives of victimhood. Today, the kafala system binds millions of migrant workers to sponsors in Gulf states, a practice critics equate with modern indentured servitude. In Qatar, reports of labor abuses during World Cup preparations drew global condemnation. Yet, oil wealth and geopolitical leverage often shield regimes from scrutiny. The Arab world is no more a monolith than the West. As we confront slavery's legacy, apartheid's echoes, and modern exploitation, perhaps the real question is, who benefits when we reduce history to a battle of victims and villains? The truth is rarely simple, but it is always worth seeking. The story of the Arab conquests is often told as a tale of faith, empire, and cultural flourishing. But beneath the surface lies a darker thread, one woven with the lives of millions of Africans who were enslaved, traded, and displaced. Long before the transatlantic slave trade, Arab merchants and conquerors were already deeply entrenched in Africa. The Arab conquests of the 7th century not only spread Islam but also established networks of trade and exploitation. African captives, referred to as abd in Arabic, became a cornerstone of this system. They were taken from regions like the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, and the Swahili coast, often through raids or as spoils of war. The roots of this practice stretch back to pre-Islamic Arabia, where tribal conflicts and slavery were commonplace. With the rise of Islam, slavery was not abolished but regulated. Islamic law provided guidelines for the treatment of slaves, yet it also codified their status as property. Over time, the demand for African slaves grew, driven by the expansion of Arab empires and the need for labor in agriculture, domestic work, and military service. One of the most infamous routes of this trade was the Zanj trade, which transported East African slaves to the Arabian Peninsula and beyond. The Zanj, primarily from the Swahili coast, were forced to work in brutal conditions, particularly in the salt marshes of southern Iraq. Their suffering culminated in the Zanj rebellion of the 9th century, a massive uprising that shook the Abbasid Caliphate and highlighted the systemic violence of the slave trade. But the Arab slave trade was not confined to the East. In North Africa, the trans-Saharan routes carried millions of Africans across the desert to markets in Cairo, Tripoli, and beyond. These journeys were deadly, with countless lives lost to thirst, exhaustion, and disease. Those who survived faced a life of servitude, often far from their homelands. The impact of this trade on Africa was profound. Entire communities were destabilized, and local economies were reshaped to serve the demands of Arab markets. The legacy of this exploitation persists in the cultural and genetic makeup of the Arab world, where African ancestry is often overlooked or marginalized. The scale of the Arab slave trade in Africa is staggering. Historians estimate that between the 7th and 20th centuries, between 10 to 18 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and transported across the Sahara, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean. This trade spanned over a millennium, far longer than the transatlantic slave trade, and its impact on Africa's demographic and cultural landscape was immense. The Arab slave trade was not a monolithic system, but a complex network of routes and markets. The trans-Saharan trade alone is believed to have transported 6 to 7 million Africans to North Africa and the Middle East. The East African trade, centered around the Swahili coast, sent millions more to the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and even as far as India. These numbers, while staggering, only tell part of the story. Countless others died during capture, on the perilous journeys, or in the harsh conditions of enslavement. The longevity of this system is equally striking. While the transatlantic slave trade lasted roughly 4 centuries, the Arab slave trade persisted for over 1,300 years, from the early Islamic conquests until the mid-20th century. It was only in the 19th and 20th centuries, under pressure from Western powers, that most Arab states formally abolished slavery. Saudi Arabia, for example, outlawed slavery in 1962, and Mauritania, the last country to do so, did not officially abolish it until 1981. Even then, enforcement was often weak, and the practice continued in various forms. The abolition of slavery in the Arab world was not voluntary. Western colonial powers, particularly Britain and France, played a significant role in pressuring Arab states to end the practice. This external intervention has led to a complex legacy. While the abolition of slavery was undoubtedly a moral imperative, it was also seen by some as an imposition of Western values, a reminder of colonial dominance that still fuels resentment in parts of the region. Yet, the end of legal slavery did not erase its legacy. Stereotypes and prejudices against Africans persist in many Arab societies. Terms like abd, slave, and zanj, a derogatory term for black Africans, are still used, often casually, reflecting deep-seated racial hierarchies. African descendants in the Arab world, such as the Akdam in Yemen or the haratin in Mauritania, continue to face systemic discrimination, often relegated to the margins of society. Even more troubling is the fact that slavery, in some form, still exists today. In countries like Mauritania, where slavery was officially abolished in 1981, human rights organizations estimate that hundreds of thousands of people remain in conditions of forced labor or servitude. These individuals, often born into slavery, are denied basic rights and freedoms, their lives dictated by the whims of their masters. Similarly, in conflict zones like Libya, reports of slave markets have emerged in recent years, a grim reminder that the horrors of the past are not as distant as we might hope. If you want to see more content like this, subscribing is the single most impactful way you can support my work and encourage future videos. If you feel this video offered value, please consider sharing it with someone who might also appreciate it. And I genuinely value your comments. They really help me understand what resonates with you. Thank you deeply for watching. Your support is invaluable.